Thank you for joining us today. This is the cyberspace and outer space session. So these windows are going to be opening soon behind us. They're lovely, but no. My name is Duncan Clark. I'm a member of the Global Board of Asia Society and happy to be a founding trustee also of Asia Society here in France. So thank you for joining us on our birthday of sorts. It's a great pleasure to welcome some distinguished panelists on both cyber and other space, outer space in this case. From my right, Admiral Édouard Guillaud, who was, once I read you were captain of CDG. That's not the airport, but actually the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle. So that's, if you need any more introduction than that, I don't know what I'm going to give you. Massimo Claudio Comparini from Thales, sorry, to the right there. Nicolas Gaume from a small American company called Microsoft. Nowmay Opalinski, who is just distributing his research like a very good Ph.D. candidate. So he has about 50, I think, of the printouts we will refer to. And then Aliette de Bodard in the middle, who is a distinguished writer of, I thought it was science fiction, but it's now speculative fiction. Okay, I love it. So you had me at that. So our topic today, and you know, because it's going to be space, we're going to be able to move in all directions at all speeds, is cyberspace and outer space. Will it be a frontier for cooperation or confrontation? We sort of know that cyberspace is already a frontier for confrontation. We'll talk about that, but we're increasingly addressing outer space because obviously dimensions are merging in many senses. The great power competition that Kevin Rudd and our panelists this morning talked about is manifesting itself in all different ways on Earth in geopolitics, but we're going to be taking it to the next level and hopefully seeing ways to avoid conflict in these domains. So I would like to start with the Admiral to hear a little bit about his perspectives, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I was not only the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier, but I've been involved very much in outer space as a military commander and in cyberspace because it was my major as an engineer when I was younger. And at the time, well, I have some gray hair now, when you had only, I would say, 5% of a class taking cyber as a major. Very long time ago. Outer space and cyberspace are fascinating fields, basically because they are both based on on two merging factors. One is technology, including many different technologies sometimes, and the second is brain. I wouldn't say intelligence because it's in French. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing as in English, but it's the use of human brain to go farther every day, to go a bit farther. But very paradoxically, they are quite different. And I would like to stress the different points because it does explain where we could be heading later on from a European or Asian or American or African perspective. Why not someday? Cyberspace is mainly based on chips, only chips. And, of course, software, meaning deep thinking. Today, it is very à la mode to talk about AI, artificial intelligence. When I was a bit younger, I was heading a lab in the French Navy specialized on AI. And then we closed at the late 90s, and it is being reopened because of new techniques. But basically, it means human thinking and chips. Outer space, on the other hand, but somebody here is much more dedicated to this field, is not only based on chips and deep thinking, but on very different technologies. It does include chemistry. You have to have some very good propellants. Nuclear energy. When you want to travel to Mars, for quite a long time, you will have a nuclear reactor, a nuclear generator. Sorry for some people, for some green people, but it's the only way up to now. Astronomy, of course, and metallurgy. And of course, I'm not mentioning other fields, including human sciences. How do you have people living in such a small space for 3 months, or 9 months, or 10 months, not circling the Earth, but really going into what we call now the outer space? This is very different, and it does explain another very different factor, a kind of discriminating factor. When you are talking about outer space, you are talking about, quote and unquote, big countries. Big by the economy, by the demography, by the economic potential, and by the research labs. It does, of course, include Russia, China, the US, at some point, thank God, EU, European Union, and probably one day India will step in. When you're talking about cyberspace, you're talking about, as I said, only chips which are easily available, Ukraine war or not, but you're talking just about brains. It does explain why in the US classification, North Korea is quite high in the capabilities. And I don't know if you have some German people here, but in the last year's US classification, Germany doesn't appear at all, meaning they are out of the what they call the third circle. So it has nothing to do with your economic power. It has nothing to do with the size of your population. Israel is a very small country and is very good. And all this means that you can play, you have two ways of describing the phenomenon. One is you can play in Premier League coming from the fourth league, exactly like, well, once again, North Korea is Premier or Second League, but Israel is obviously in Premier League. You have somebody who is out of the scope, which is, of course, the US, so much ahead. But other countries like UK, Russia, France included, still play in the Premier League. On the other hand, you can present cyber as a leveling factor, exactly in the same way as in the 1960s, the nuclear weapons were a leveling factor and allowed medium-sized countries such as UK or France to stay on the, as permanent members of the Security Council, fighting above your class, if I may say so. Please don't quote me. I know people who would shoot at me. And obviously, both fields offer, as for any human deed, both opportunities and potential for conflicts. This is very precisely what we see every day. Everybody has been reading things or hearing things about ransomwares, but you have other things in the cyber warfare system. Everybody knows that the Chinese, the Americans, and the Russians have more or less militarized our outer space, close outer space, with killer satellites. And when you visit, for instance, when you visit the, which I did, the command center for space in the Moscow suburbs, on the main place, when you enter the site, you have a 1970 model of Soviet Union killer. So you know where you are, you know where you stand. It means that people have been thinking of using space as a storage for ammunition, as a place to prevent others from using the space capabilities for observation, for instance, or for communication. We have no borders, either in space, in outer space, or in cyberspace, we just have frontiers. And as any frontiers seen by human mankind, someday the frontier is reached and humankind will set them farther away to have a new frontier. This is very fascinating. It can be very dangerous. And once again, and I will end with that, it's both a threat but an opportunity to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you. Technology is a blunt instrument, a theme that runs through. I'm going to turn next to Massimo, if you'll indulge me to look further to your left. Massimo from Thales, please.
Thank you, Duncan, and very pleased to be here. And I was thinking, looking at the title of this panel, that, okay, we have, in few words, the key topics that also the Admiral just touched. First, technology, cyberspace, space technology. Okay, technology dimension. Frontier, which is something which is inherent, connected to space. In my imagination, when I was really a kid and I see the first footprint on the moon, of course, it's a kind of frontier inspiration, what you can do in space and leaving the Earth. And then cooperation and confrontation and even conflict. And those are dimensions that we have, all of them in those days in the space activities and the impact of space technologies in our society, on our economies, on the geopolitical issues, as well as why not, on the inspiration of the human being in the coming years, also decades, and why not centuries. So in the last 50 years, I mean, from the Apollo time to the Artemis time, you know, the new phase to the moon is named Artemis. From the Apollo time to Artemis time is not just 50 years. In the 60s, space was just witnesses of the political power of the two big powers at that time, no question about. And also the technology frontier was pushed by this geopolitical fight, let's put it this way. What happened in the last decades, there was a number of countries, let's put Europe as a power, but inside Europe, of course, France, UK, even Italy. We open to space technologies as well as with other countries like India and China. So space power today. So it's an evolution. It's an evolution that we see also in how the space technologies are being used for our life, for our economy, for our society. Global connectivity, the capability to observe the Earth from space, which is extremely, extremely important. Just thinking about how we can understand from space what happened on the poles. And the poles, North Pole, South Pole, are extremely important places for our planet. First, because they are a kind of sample of the status of the planet, and second, for their geopolitical interest and geopolitical, let's say, relevance. So space has moved in terms of technology. Technologies closer and closer to our life through connectivity, Earth observation, navigation. It's normal for us to have our very precise position through satellite constellations, and then still the outer space. Of course, after the first wave of the moon exploration, we had a number of scientific missions going to far worlds like Saturn, Titan, deep space, outside the solar system. And now we have a second wave on the lunar exploration, which is completely different to the first one. I'm always saying in some interviews that we are not coming back to the moon to spend a long weekend. You mentioned that. We will stay on the planet. We will work on the planet. We need to find and we need to have the technologies to stay 3 months, 6 months, and even longer on the planet for a number of reasons. Of course, still science, but it's not only science. It's also, may we use the resources of the planet, the moon, starting from the moon, for something which is vital for the Earth? And do we have an economy dimension of the lunar exploration? The answer is yes, and the answer is also passing through our capability to stay in space close to the Earth, as you mentioned. So the human presence in the low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station is, where commercial space station will be in a short time, in few years. Maybe in the second round I can tell something a little bit more precise, and to have in-orbit servicing, so build infrastructure in the low Earth orbit, or, unfortunately, still in the geopolitical battle, to go there and to act on the assets that are so important for our economies, not only for a peaceful intent. So, in this technology dimension, as well as in this, let's say, impact of space technologies, what was a kind of root in the 60s? The geopolitical power that you have through space is back. It's back because when we talk about the Chinese station, just an example, of course, there are scientific experiments, but it's a kind of outpost which is 400 kilometers above us. So we could have also other relevance. And the fact that in the last few years, all the big countries build up space force, or let's say the space dimension of their activities, it's a clear and direct sign of the relevance of space in this respect. And just last two words, I'm sure that we'll come back to that, frontiers. It's a frontier in terms of really the distance from Earth. So how far we can go. How far we can go with today's technologies, propulsion technologies. How far we can go with the future propulsion technologies. How long we can stay on the planet. We need power. We need food, so how long we can stay. But also frontier, from another perspective, has been mentioned, of course, in our life, many people talk about AI, about artificial intelligence. I'm not sure that all the people that talk about really understand what we're talking about, but nevertheless, I'm really convinced that space, it is already and it will be the ground and the environment where man-machine cooperation will achieve another frontier. Look into the cost to send a man, when it will be possible, to Mars. For sure, we will have few astronauts, but we will have much more rovers, automatic machine, robot machine, working with the astronauts. And by definition, those cognitive capabilities in automatic machine will help the man to do what they want to on the planet. Okay, so that was just a few hints in the first round, Duncan.
Thank you. This is the appetizers. And Nicolas, from Microsoft's perspective, obviously you're working with the infrastructure that's being put in place. Tell us about the applications.
Well, actually, may I start saying that before being a Microsoft executive, I'm also a space entrepreneur. And I mentioned that because when I started my journey into space, that was about 8 years ago, and it was a very different world. And the idea was simple. There's existing infrastructure that were out of the Russian-American partnership, and as the entire humanity was looking at space as a more concrete application and usage, there were more and more rooms for a commercial company to raise. In fact, my company named Space Cargo Unlimited wanted to focus on manufacturing in space for Earth. And one of the key partnership that allowed us to flourish was with Massimo, a team in Italy, Thales Alenia Space, Italy. And we could work together and start building solutions for the future of agriculture and viticulture on Earth, thanks to space. Now, as we move forward, we realize that infrastructure is something that we may take for granted when it becomes a commodity. Value shift to the usages. Jeff Bezos often says that Amazon couldn't have existed without AT&T, Federal Express, and Visa. Now, that really allowed them to build Amazon as we know it. Surely, the trend until a few years was pretty clear, pretty path. As an entrepreneur myself, I started to work with Chinese projects, American projects, and I realized the tensions were raising. Actually, one member of my team that was one of the leaders of European Chinese first missions was denied entry in America, and it couldn't work on any American projects. And the tension continued to grow until now, where I do not see anything but a confrontation ahead of us. So I mentioned that because it saddened me that humanity always has to choose between cooperation and confrontation. Now, Microsoft, I sold a startup to Microsoft, led me to work for them, and today I run the business of space, the business of Microsoft in space. So we basically work with infrastructure company to provide them the business of our hyperscale cloud. And I mentioned this because hyperscale cloud is, going back to the Admiral few words, the gigantic power of crunching data sets to extract intelligence. As Massimo said, we do not realize how much space is everywhere. All the images, all the data we get out of space change so many things in our life, from the way we take political decisions today for war to sustainable measurements, down to insurance companies measuring how they're going to set their financial strategy, down to logistical companies optimizing the path for their ships around the world, and so many other applications. All of this is being digitally transformed. And it happens that hyperscale cloud, so large cloud that have been actually growing for the usage of large numbers of people, were nurtured in only two areas, China and America. It is completely impossible today, and certainly nothing is impossible, but hyperscale cloud, that is the power of compute that Amazon, Microsoft, Google have in America, and similarly Alibaba, Huawei and others, requires a volume of users that is super significant and way bigger than anything you can find in Germany, in France, in Israel, in Africa, and many other countries. And that's a fact to have in mind, going back to the confrontation we're going between mainly America and China, to realize that the cloud computes are in these two countries. And moving forward, that's what happened to space now is what has happened to other industrial areas in the past. For instance, today, a car is mainly microchip, going back to the Admiral, and software. Tesla has introduced a car that could be uploaded with new features. And basically, that was something completely impossible to think of. Now, today, we still operate many satellites. We send hardware into space with software in ROMs and specific hardware. And once they're out of date, we send new satellites. Well, pretty much now, you could upgrade these satellites and make them so more powerful, add features, and repurpose them for civilian or military purposes. So, going back to your topic of the day, confrontation versus cooperation, I think that the merits of digital transformation are extremely strong. This is a revolution that's just starting in space, whereas it has affected so many other industries before. And it is today led by two countries, America and China, which happens to also create this divide between the overall political ambition to capture the resources of space and establish permanent settlement on the Moon and Mars. So my testimonial as an American company representative here is that indeed we are going to a confrontation.
Thank you. Nowmay, can you point us in the direction of cooperation? Or you're a research guy, so let's hear the research. And there is, you do have a handout, and otherwise perhaps you can use the rose window to describe, because it looks like some of the charts that I saw. Imagine these are clusters of the internet. We're going to listen to you now on your Ph.D.
Maybe we will have to give other leaflets to the panelists. They are just there, so we have time. So after our exploration of a little bit of explanation of cyber warfare as described by the Admiral and also of outer space, I would like us to take a step back to look at cyberspace, not outer space here, and to look at the broader picture of the clash of visions and representation regarding the architecture of the internet and how it should be governed. This study is at the core of my research at the Geopolitics of the Datasphere lab in Paris 8 University, where we mostly study how the geopolitical conflicts are now taking place on the different layers of the internet. So my speech will briefly come back to the arrival of the internet in Asia to then explain how state actions within cyberspace contributed to make it a space of competition. And I will finally expose how the different conception of it could potentially lead to its fragmentation along national lines. That's what we will see with the leaflet. So first to start, I would like us to remember that internet arrived in Asia along academic cooperation with Europe and the United States at the end of the 80s. It firstly emerged in Japan and South Korea through scientific cooperation with the US, whereas China was one of the last major countries of the continent to join the internet in 1987. Again, through a scientific cooperation with Germany. After a 4-year-long cooperation, the Chinese government allowed this exchange to happen with the first email from China sent from the Institute for Computer Application in Beijing to the Karlsruhe University in Germany. Interestingly, the title of the email already reflected China's own conception of the internet. It had the following title: "Across the Great Wall, we can reach every corner of the world." Since this time and after then, divergent visions from Western conception of what should be the internet emerged in Asia. This is what scholars call the localization or the regionalization of the internet. It was it broke the myth of neutrality of the net wished by its libertarian founding fathers, American founding fathers, which were thinking that the core value of internet was its openness and equal treatment of users and data wherever they are. They were wrong. The major blow to this ideal came from governments in a top-down fashion. First, European governments were the first to repress certain unlawful content on the internet. But governments in the East, in the Far East, went much further and imposed a much more controlled vision of what should be the internet. The whipping use of content filtering, censorship, local storage data restrictions have emerged there, drawing new borders within the network of networks. I do not want to oversimplify because Asia gives us a complex picture, but still there is only a minority of countries in Asia which do share this openness ideal. In fact, most of these countries are in favor of more state control of the internet. However, there are different degrees of control, the most extreme example being Iran and China. Very early on, China imposed itself as the forerunner in the race of state control of the internet, as the Chinese government has built its own network and designed it to ensure its total control of the data transiting inside and outside the national network. However, one should never forget that the first brick of the Great Firewall that we all know was led by an American company, the leading router manufacturer Cisco, which redesigned its products to adapt them to the Chinese government needs of content blocking and data filtering. So the fragmentation of the internet also came from cooperation. Now, this being said, after it succeeded to impose its control internally, Beijing also started to promote this vision of a state-centered internet governance on the international stage. China is opposed to the traditional multi-stakeholder framework, which includes the active participation of non-government actors, such as private companies and the civil society. China, as well as Russia, are challenging this model by invoking the necessity of rebalancing the equilibrium of power within the internet. They denounce the hegemony of Western powers over the internet and say that the multi-stakeholder framework is a tool to keep their hegemony. So basically what we are currently witnessing is a harsh battle of narratives within international institutions about how internet should be governed. Now, Russia and China are pushing for giving more powers to multilateral institutions, such as the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, they want to increase the purview of the United Nations to extend its power outside of its only role of global standard setting body. They want the United Nations to take on missions related to internet policy and infrastructure, and finally giving more power to governments to regulate its use. The last example of this confrontation occurred a few weeks ago, with the fierce competition between the US and Russia around the nomination of the next ITU Secretary General. Rashid Ismailov, the Russian candidate, was proposing to take power away from the US and to increase the sovereignty of national states in cyberspace. Finally, the American candidate won, but the battle is far from over, and the fears are still very present. The current head of the US-based ICANN, a very important institution, which is non-governmental, said that if the Russian candidate would win, people around the world might not be able to connect to one single interoperable internet. Even if this argument is commonly used by American stakeholders with a certain political goal in mind, of course they have their interest. It tells some truth when we look at the shape of the networks. That's why I distributed to you this presentation. I will explain a little bit. So to give a clearer idea of what are the tangible impacts of the clash of narratives, I will show you some extracts from my research. So if you look at the second picture, so you will see a graph. I will show you how the different visions of the internet are impacting the shape of the networks of each country's internet. So before we start to explore the logical dimension of the internet, I will briefly explain what is internet. So the internet is a network of networks made of autonomous systems. So what you see in this graph, all the little points are called autonomous systems. An autonomous system is like an internet service provider, and it is administrating IP addressing, and it is managing the routing of data across cyberspace. So when you use your phone, you will use the autonomous system of your internet service provider, for example, Orange. Some of these ASs are private companies, and each AS has to sign and establish partnerships agreement with their homologues to exchange data. So as a geographer, if you want to map the internet, you have to look at these agreements. This is what you see here. So you see the connectivity of Europe, the 10 major European networks. You see the connectivity of the 10 major European networks. And what is interesting to see here when we compare with Asia is that it's very difficult to differentiate them, even if you have the colors. The fact is that in Europe, our networks are so intertwined that we have high resiliency but very loose control of the networks. If you look at the other page, you will see the 10 first networks in Asia. The picture is completely different. In Asia, you have, depending on the country, but you have very few links connecting to other networks, which mean that you really have frontier within the internet with some countries such as China. Iran is very far away, if you see, and Vietnam, which has very narrow path to connectivity with other countries. It is a very so you have two extremities in the spectrum. You would have Singapore and Hong Kong, which are kind of the gateways of this regional network, and China, Iran, or Vietnam, which have a very strict control and which have main gates which enable them to filter traffic and also close their internet. This is what is happening in Iran these days. Basically, they have just some gates to the internet. They have 3 gates. They block them. No other connections can get out of the country, basically. So this is typically a case of fragmentation of the internet. But this bears shortcomings for an ambitious power such as China, because China wants to be a standard settler, but it does not have a central role to play within the internet. It is at the periphery, actually. The US is at the core, Europe is at the core. So now China is having an ambitious strategy of changing its position within the internet. And this goes through an ambitious investment program where you can see the last page with a map. So China is investing in a massive infrastructure to link directly its network to every other country when it's possible. So the Chinese operators do not have to rely on other countries for their own routing. So what is China doing is to reduce dependencies on routing hubs in the US and Europe to have direct connection, for example, with Africa, with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia, for security purposes also, and also to have less issues in case of sanctions. So this is typically the case of confrontation within cyberspace. I will conclude briefly, sorry I was quite long, but the multiple geopolitical conflicts are deeply impacting the shape of the internet. The network of networks was born with a cooperation agenda, and its maintenance as a formidable tool of communication, as we said, depends on its interoperability. The stakes have never been greater about the future of the internet and what shape it will take in the coming decades. Some predict we will witness the advent of a splinternet, so different internets. I'm not sure of this, but one thing is sure, we need to do more cross-disciplinary research on these topics, and we need to understand better the position of Asian countries to identify what will be the future spaces for cooperation or confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nowmay. Very much. So we talked about the internet and the internet, I suppose these are. And I wonder if you can use this software that you've used to depict these to geospatial infrastructure. You're going to need more colors, I think, for the amount of activity happening in space, but very interesting background. Thank you. NFTs even. Okay. That's the next panel. It's not the next panel. So we'll move on to Aliette to hear your perspective. And you actually trained at École Polytechnique in engineering.
Yep.
And so tell us about this fiction gig.
Yes.
And space, sorry, our topic.
So yes, my main training is as an engineer, but I guess I'm mostly here in my second capacity, which is that I write science fiction. So my perspective on it tends to be more speculative for starters, and also taking a longer view and projecting things further into the future, and trying to imagine possible scenarios and putting them in books, because one has to also be entertaining sometimes. And I guess part of what makes both cyberspace and outer space really interesting is that they both push back what we think of the traditional limits of what it is to be human. They push back our physical limitations, because if you think about it, we were mostly designed to remain on Earth, right? When you go into space and you have reduced gravity, you will lose your muscle tone pretty fast, right? Because we have been optimized as a body to function in the Earth gravity, and then that's it. So there's a whole host of adaptations that need to be made for us to function into space. We are also pushing back the limits of what it means to be physically present. Whether that's in space or mostly in cyberspace, there's physical versus virtual presence, and what that means in terms of you can have avatars, there's all sorts of there was Second Life, you have now the metaverse, so you've got all sorts of, I guess, ways of being there that don't actually involve being physically present. And I guess we've all had a taste of this when we had the pandemic and everybody moved to Zoom, right? Which is one way in which this is becoming very democratized and having a daily impact on us. And finally, what also pushes back the limits of what it means to be human, and other people have touched upon this, is we have the rise and the development of AIs and robots who both exist in cyberspace and are probably going to exist in space, because they basically go where we cannot go. They perform tasks that we are either unwilling to perform or that are too costly for us. As Massimo was saying, it's very easy to, comparatively fairly easy to send a robot into space. If you have to send a human into space, they're going to need oxygen, they're going to need the right gravity, you have to do not take off too fast or you're going to crush them. We're pretty fragile as a species. So there's a lot of issues around this, but around, are AI sentient? What kind of rights we're going to be talking about? What kind of agenda they're going to have? And we were talking about cooperation and confrontation, and that might also be the confrontation and cooperation with other species and other beings, some of which are of our own making, but may well escape our control. It There's also a question of flow of information, and I think in different ways, right? I think we've all seen with the rise of the internet the issue of the quality of the information. There have been, misinformation campaigns, and it's become really hard to tell what is accurate and what is not accurate, what is truth, what is not truth. There have been large-scale operations of political and other entities trying to manipulate or to shape this, at the very least, to their own advantage. And in space, you're going to have, well, first off, the issue of an excess of information that you need to filter and treat, but also the further we go, the bigger the lag, right? Because information only travels as fast as the light, and if you go very, very far away, we're going to have to deal with the fact that it takes a very long time to come back to us. And I mean, it's actually a classic science fiction problem of how do you actually maintain communications, and a lot of science fiction writers just decide to go we're just going to pretend that this is not a problem. But it is going to raise a number of problems of how do we communicate? How do you keep in touch? How do you maintain cohesion, especially in outer space? And then in cyberspace, how do you determine identity? How do you determine self? How do you determine trust in who you're talking to? And some of these subjects we're already grappling with, but it is probably going to become more and more acute and more widespread in terms of what it means. So I think part of what's happening, and you can already see happen, but will also happen when we go into space, is you have those communities and infrastructure that go beyond the traditional meaning of borders. So you have, cyberspace already blurs borders, and so what happens to nations? What happens when we reach another planet, right? What form of governments are we going to have? What forms of, not even governments, but communities? How are we going to maintain ties with the places we originated from? And a lot of it in SF, which has thought a lot about those sorts of things, and a lot of it has relied on the US manifest destiny, the push to the West, or colonization as seen through the Western gaze, right? A kind of mother planet and then kind of satellites and colonies. And I think it's an interesting model in the sense that it happened historically, but that's rather unlikely to pan out the same way. So I think that we're probably going to see very interesting things happen on a sociological point of view. And what the Admiral was saying also in terms of having to deal with isolation, and if you're on a spaceship and you're going to, say, Mars, and it's going to take you month and month and month, you're going to have to deal with the fact that we were not made for being alone in a very small metal space, and that does things to the psyche. All right? So I think it's a really interesting series of things to think about when we are trying to extrapolate what it means to be in outer space, what it means to be in cyberspace. I mean, it's also probably, human beings have remained human beings for a long time, and you can, one of the things that I find fascinating is you will find those texts from, say, 14th century Chinese merchants who are lamenting the loss of their daughter to plague, and you will immediately recognize what it is that you are talking about. And so in some sense, materially, a lot has changed in the way that we live and in the way that we conceive of ourselves as an individual, in the communities and the bonds that we forge. But also we have remained very similar, and there's a kind of thread of continuous, we haven't changed much. So I think that as we haven't changed much, unfortunately, we're going to see more of the same things playing out, and that kind of continuous tug between whether we should actually unite in the face of something that's larger than ourselves and that we might not understand, or whether we should just fight each other for resources, both of which we have been pretty good at doing throughout history.
Thank you. On that note, I mean, given the fact that humans tend to sort of mess things up terribly wherever they go, and Admiral, your point about, you know, increasing the amount of robotics, what is the point actually of carbon-based life forms like going into space? I mean, in the past it's been a political or a propaganda. Of course, you mentioned the space race. I mean, that was very important, obviously, to have the flag. And are we going? You described we're going back to that level of competition in space. So, would it be a distraction, perhaps, to have manned space exploration now, or is this inevitable?
A human being has always been very willing to understand and to go farther, beyond the horizon. And space, outer space, is a new horizon. And as any horizon, each time you think you're nearer from it, it goes farther. So it's a never-ending story, whether we like it or not. It has been mentioned that space brings us many very, very useful things. Earth observation, not only with meteorological satellites, but to have a look at crops, to observe what is happening in Ukraine today, probably too. It's a fantastic backup for fiber optics. As you know, roughly 95%, well, figures vary slightly, of communication goes through fiber optics. But the 5 remaining percent are of paramount importance. When you're in the middle of nowhere, namely in the middle of the ocean or in the Sahel area or in some desert in Asia, if you don't have any satellite, you have no information. You have no access to data. It has to go through it. So it's both a backup and a tremendously important way of access to knowledge and data. It is, well, without any GPS or Galileo or the Chinese Beidou or GLONASS, well, we wouldn't have any smartphone. When I'm on my bike, I wouldn't go very easily from one place to another in Paris or elsewhere. So space and outer space do bring us really many, many benefits. But of course, you have side effects. And it's roughly the same for cyber. When I was in my, what we called informatique at the time, and not cyber in French, in the early and late 80s, we were talking about an Ethernet with 1 megabyte bandwidth. I mean, have a look at what is happening today. And when we were launching satellites, the upload was 256 K. And we were saying, well, if we could double that, that would be great. And well, it looks like archaeology now, and very ancient times. So we need it. The speed of information has obvious side effects because people do not take time to rest, to keep cool, to keep calm, and to think things over. This is why when you listen to the news today on the TV, everybody is commenting everything with probably 1% of the necessary knowledge to have a sound comment on what is happening. But yet, how could we do without it? In no way can we go backwards. We are not go back to the time when, during the First World War, they were using doves and pigeons. It's too late. We couldn't go, well, we couldn't have doctors, we couldn't have labs, we couldn't have medics, we couldn't have forecasts, weather forecasts, and we all know that this is very important, specifically for both navigation and agriculture. Well, we cannot go backwards, so we have to go forward, trying not to mess up things once more, as we are used to.
Nicolas, I believe you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few use cases. I mean, the Admiral talked about how much space is critical to Earth, to have a understanding of the Earth phenomenon and better telecommunicate. Microsoft announced a few weeks ago that we're working a lot in Taiwan, many reasons. But the firefighters in Taiwan have set up a system to communicate if no energy was available anymore in the country, if all internet was down, if all technology were disrupted for climate reasons or others, they would still be able to communicate and coordinate their actions. So that's the kind of opportunities that space brings to Earth. We talked about Earth observation and everything that we learned from it. I wanted to take a few words of, because your question was, why would we want to go to space? Well, my startup, Space Cargo Limited, is manufacturing in space for Earth. And there are many, many things you can do in space for Earth that are very exciting. And new materials, if you try to create new materials on Earth, gravity gets the higher, the better mass go down and higher go, and the lighter one go up. Without gravity, you could make better alloys and more robust manufacturing. We actually expose plants to the environmental space at a very young age, and we create new variety of plants because they survived the stress of the absence of gravity. Now are able to defeat climate change stresses related. So we're actually growing with INRAE in France and CNES, a new variety of vine plants that are actually more resilient to extreme heats, mildew, or other fungi. And we will apply these work to other agricultural products, and we would be in a position to actually hopefully find ways to feed humanity tomorrow. This couldn't have done without space. And looking forward, and I think Massimo and others told about it, there's resources out there. There are materials that we are going to miss on Earth that may be completely critical for our technology on Earth. So all this means there's definitely a lot of opportunities to continue to pursue.
I think let's say, the Admiral already said, I mean, we will never stop to go further. I mean, it's our
wild.
nature.
It's just human nature.
It's a human nature. So, I mean, we will go. And of course, this is also quite a long-standing debate. Okay, we have so many issues on this planet. Why we should spend, let's say, 500 billion go to Mars? This is a kind of question that you hear many times, but it's not consistent. I mean, we will never stop to understand who we are, where we are, and where we from. And space is essential in that. But when I talk about space exploration and outer space, I make a connection with our small garden. Without space today, we cannot even imagine a sustainable Earth. It's essential to make a sustainable Earth. Agriculture. The population on this planet is growing, more or less exponential, but it's growing. So we cannot be sustainable if we don't have a more productive and more sustainable agriculture. Very simple. During the pandemic era, I mean last 2 years and a half, in the first 3 months, we monitor from the geospatial, we monitor the pattern of life. So how the pattern of life on large scale and also in a small scale has been changed due to the pandemic diffusion. Now, of course, this dimension will be always coupled with the other one, which is go to an asteroid and use the mineral resources, the metals that are there. It could appear science fiction, but it's not. Honestly, a few years ago, if someone told me, hey, Massimo, do you think that in 5 years from now someone can raise 1.5 billion to build up the first ever commercial space station? I would be quite skeptical. But this is going to happen. And this is going to happen, why? Because big pharma They spend billions a year in R&D, and the impact to make their research in microgravity, it will be a kind of revolution. 3D printing, organic 3D printing, is one of the most promising made in space. And Nicolas, you mentioned that. So, if, let's say, very, very likely like what was the Antarctica, go to the moon will help to understand how we can extract resources from a planet and back to the Earth. I'm sure that deep space in the next decades will be essential to have the resources to make sustainable the life here. And of course, again, it's a question of cooperation and confrontation, because it's not cheap to do all of that. So you need to have countries together, and even the Americans today, they cannot imagine a mission without, for instance, an important cooperation with Europe. At the same time, we will have confrontation. So I think that this is a debate that will be, in my mind, for long, and it will be quite interesting. Imagine in the future another turning point. You mentioned, Nicolas, about the exponential growth of the computational capability, which is what could be this dimension when we will achieve the singularity point. I mean, when we will have enough power on Earth and in space that an AA, artificial intelligence-based machine, can work to modify itself. That will happen. I mean, the scientists, they don't know if it's going to happen in 40 years or 50 years, but it will happen. And at that point, a robotic machine that you sent in a far planet, they can work not only to take decisions without control or without, let's say, the time to go back to the Earth, which is already, it's not the case, but to modify themselves.
Thanks. Introducing the concepts of billion-dollar cargoes coming back. We can expect space piracy. We can expect space douane, the customs. How are they going to get their cut?
It's already in place. Admiral Guillaud already said, I mean, we have already the capability to go and to approach a satellite and to work to destroy the capability of that satellite, which is a kind of piracy.
And the Admiral, you mentioned that currently, so 5% of internet connectivity, perhaps globally, is going through space, because the vulnerabilities we're becoming very acutely aware of with the recent mysterious attacks on Nord Stream and other infrastructures, on expectation of attacking submarine cables. I think, Nowmay, you have a very interesting map in your handout also of Chinese submarine cables around the world.
So yes, if we want to continue to talk about this confrontation, we shouldn't be too naive about when we talk about technologies, and of course we all want to have a better future with new technologies, but we shouldn't forget that every company or every country has its own interest in developing a technology, and that in some countries, maybe in Europe we forgot, but if you go in Asia, scientific development is intertwined with nationalist discourse, and the setting and mind setting is very different. And maybe in the US they have this mind setting also a little bit more than here. So what is interesting to see now is that when we talk about internet as a common good, or for example outer space as a space of possibilities, we need also to take into consideration that conflicts will appear and how infrastructure could be shared by everyone. The problem we face now with internet is that what was before considered as a common good or shared between companies, and which was not a political question, such as submarine cables, as you said, Admiral, 95% of our communications are going through fiber optics, mainly submarine cables. Right. these submarine cables are getting very sensitive. In the 90s, in the 2000s, you had a huge building of submarine cables across first like the transatlantic and across Europe, through the Indian Ocean, and then to reach Asia and Africa. And at the moment, you didn't have such geopolitical tensions. Now, what we see is that when a new project is coming, for example, very lately, the Peace Cable, which will link Karachi to Marseille, and which will link China through Pakistan, was being pressured by the US government in a not very direct way, but backdoors. And in the French press, we heard that the CEO of Orange Submarine Cable said that they had to face pressure from Americans saying that this project should not be done. Finally, the French company said they will still go on, but many pressures are being put on this kind of projects, even if looking on the French perspective, it's interesting because we would have better connections with Asian countries. But the thing is, all these really good tools are being weaponized by different countries, and this kind of competition is also taking place in the Pacific. We've seen several projects with Chinese companies involved, which were blocked by the Americans and Australia, specifically cables going to little Pacific islands, but also cables which have gone through Hong Kong up to Singapore and other countries. So now you have really a big fragmentation going on in this type of infrastructure. And we should not forget that when we talk about outer space, now it's still kind of a green field, but political consideration will come, and also question of governance and how do we put rules in that space will also be very important to keep it a common good. So
as we move into space, I just want to go to one specific example. The current initiatives for massive internet services in space from Starlink, OneWeb, Viasat, G-Space, Telesat, Amazon. Of course, these are increasingly companies as well as nation states. Many other proposals are still coming. They are turning Earth orbit into a freeway. These constellations are fragile and they're subject to destructive action. One side effect, and this is a quote from my brother-in-law, my sister had the good sense to marry an astrophysicist at JPL, and he's launching a satellite in 24-25, the Sphere X, which would map the entire sky in near-infrared spectroscopy. The reason I mentioned this, he's saying his project may be the last astronomical facility to operate from Earth orbit because of this crowding that's happening in space. So astronomy increasingly is becoming, from the ground, is becoming difficult. And he was saying that, astrophysicists are adaptable people. They'll find a way around, but the impacts on society will be large and hard to predict of these systems that are being built. So just to open that up to how do we manage this new layer of corporate as well as nation-state infrastructure? I guess we saw on the geopolitics side, we saw in Ukraine, right, the issue that I guess it was Starlink was suddenly stopping to work when Ukrainian troops crossed into contested territory. That was in the news last week. So we're already seeing this corporate,
yes, even Starlink. I mean, I think Elon Musk tried to send some satellites over Iran to give alternative way of communicating for people. It didn't work.
Right.
But you see, and what you said about it was very interesting about Taiwan, the Microsoft project.
Exactly.
Of course, you say that it's related to natural disasters, but there are maybe other interests.
Man-made disasters.
For sure, because imagine in case of conflict, I suppose they want to have an access to internet. So if you cut main submarine cables linking Taiwan to other countries, they will be in a very deep problem. So of course now outer space is beginning to be another way of finding other solutions in case of crisis, and especially because internet is so important. If you go to other countries, such as, for example, I've been to Pakistan several times, and there now they have completely changed, and they are all on the Beto the Chinese GPS, basically. And so you have a big shift in many global South countries, which are choosing to be with the Chinese model of Chinese technology of geolocalization systems, because it's also more accurate in Asia, because they have more satellites in these parts of the world and it's better covered. So you see that a lot of interests are being crossed there, and what is seen as competition between companies and only like in the liberal order can also have very important geopolitical implications.
I think that you open another point, which is we have a change of the landscape. I mean, until a few years ago, space was the kind of space that we're talking about was in the hand of the space agencies. Now this is changing. I mean, the first contract that NASA gave for the human lander, so the first, let's say, machine that will make back the astronaut to the moon, not only from Earth to the moon, but also from the Lunar Gateway, a station that we're building in cislunar orbit to the moon, about $10 billion. SpaceX has been awarded on the basis of the fact that they decide to invest $4 billion. So a mission which is critical, let's say, for what we say from now to 2032, 2035, the estimation is about 100, 120 missions on the moon. So a technology so critical, it's co-funded, largely co-funded by a private company, whatever it is, SpaceX, Blue Origin. I think that this is an element which is quite important to think about personally, but I'm a kind of old space guy because next year will be my 40 years in career in space. I'm a little bit, I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable because we're talking about organizations that, of course, with full respect of the genius that founded them, are private organizations in the hand of one or few people. You know, I was thinking myself when, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, Twitter just switched off the POTUS address tweet. Now, regardless of who was the POTUS, the point is that a private company in the today information society has the power to switch off the Twitter account of POTUS. Now, if you invest so huge amount of money, you want to have also power in the decisions. And I think that outer space, and for the reason that we said during the discussion, I'm a bit more comfortable that something in the end of the government, of the public, let's say, organizations, than on just a few private companies. Of course, it's a complex debate because at the same time, private is booming space and is making possible something that a few years ago was inconceivable. And maybe it's a little bit more philosophical and ethic topics than technology, but I think it's important, and space is really looking to this kind of evolution.
No, I agree with Massimo. I run private companies or represent private companies, so I also appreciate there's a sense of urgency and a sense of ownership that a private company will make things happen that maybe large institutions be more challenged. I mean, the cost of Artemis is staggering, whereas you can see SpaceX is doing things at very different costs. So, but I think that is very interesting to see that talking about the internet, it grew with very great intent, with little regulation. Eventually, today we have, particularly in Europe, very conscious of what's at stake and what needs to be done. RGPD was one first step, and Europe has the ability to impose some, let's say, peaceful government structure in the interest of all. And I think that we do need to, and I'm talking as a European, to have the same perspective on space, because the more we're going to go into a political tension, the more we're going to go into getting resources I mean, in effect, Moon is like Antarctica. You're not supposed to commercialize and privatize the resource of the Moon, but we all know that within the next 15 years, and we're not talking about like long-term perspective, like 10, 15 years, we'll start to have a fight for land on the Moon. And that's probably why not? Think it's one of the wars ahead of us.
I think you've got, this tension between, governments having like large-scale geopolitical considerations when they go into outer space or cyberspace, but also governments being the one that are able to regulate the private companies, and on the other hand, the private companies not being encumbered by. Well, I mean, that's not quite true, but being, let's say, less encumbered sometimes by like larger geopolitical constraints, depending on which country, which company we're talking about, and being more motivated by short-term profits and things that might not play so nicely with outer space, where you have those larger scale projects, and also where it's a little bit of there's not much that's being currently regulated, and that's probably something that we are going to have a big fight about.
The first real estate brokerage on the Moon will be something to look at. Admiral, you started by saying scale is what's the most important. So from a European perspective, versus maybe, say, more state-driven China, let's say, and a hybrid state and corporate-driven United States in space, where does Europe fit? Do we have the scale of companies, or will we have to have continued nation-state ownership?
Well, we have the overall scale. I mean, we have the financial power to do it, at least at the same level as the United States. And it was mentioned that even for Artemis, the United States has been asking European countries and European companies to invest and to provide some very specific equipment, which we were good at.
Happen.
So it's we have that. We have probably the correct technology in nearly all the fields. Talking about outer space propellants, power generators, including we have been the European Space Agency has been conducting trials with human beings, keeping them in a lying position for a month.
Like COVID? Oh, sorry, I thought that was COVID, but sorry.
It was just before COVID.
Okay, sorry.
We didn't use the results for COVID, unfortunately, yet.
It's for Netflix.
So we have all the bricks, but we have no plan, meaning we have no architect. And this is what we are lacking badly. In Europe, not only in EU, but in Europe as a whole. As a larger body. Now, maybe we will wake up and all what is happening today in the rest of the world, meaning climate change, conflicts, peripheral conflicts, will be used as a prolific wake-up call for in a European perspective. We lack ambition, as a matter of fact. We mainly lack a common ambition.
Is there any ambitious person in the room who wants to ask a question? It's a challenge to Europe. We have, I think, Mark, I see, with a hand raised. Do we have a mic? Or we're going to have to... We can hear you, and I can repeat for the benefit of the recording. regulation to avoid conflict in both cyber, maybe too late, but in space in general? Anyone want to weigh in on that? Any ambitious people on the?
I think that this is a very relevant point for space technologies. Technologies went too fast compared to the reaction time to have the right regulation in place. Why I say that? Because today when we talk about sustainability, we talk about sustainability of space environment per se. Because on one hand, democratization of space means that you can send a CubeSat or you can send mega constellation of 1,000 satellites, but without a regulation, that will be the perfect hand of the space environment, because you will pollute with a huge amount and exponential growth of debris, something which is essential for our life. So it's a fact that again, on one hand, we talk about Starlink, we talk about those kind of private back mega constellations, just launching tens, hundreds and thousands satellites, but there is the other side of the coin. If you lose the control of just few of them, you can pollute and you can make completely useless large part of, for instance, low Earth orbit, which is essential for a number of things. So I think it's really an hot topic. I don't know if I don't think that, but the Admiral is much more let's say in depth in this. I don't think that regulation per se can avoid confrontation and conflict, but for sure can be used, let's say, to make a sustainable path in the future.
Admiral, I think you were going to say something then, Nowmay? Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
No, I don't want to cut you off.
Okay. Regulation always helps, but as Massimo said, they're just late, too late. So one of the nice things, because we are human beings, and one of the very bad things, because we are human beings, is we will avoid confrontation by self-restraint. So you have to be very optimistic when you believe that any man will be able of self-restraining himself. But on the other hand, the path and the momentum of technology is so fast that I do not see any other way. So this goes through dialogue, through philosophy, I mean, really, and social sciences, much more than through the mere use of new sciences or advances in sciences and technology.
Well, I actually, as an entrepreneur, my life for the past 30 years about disrupting thanks to technology. And pretty much in every single of my company, it was always unregulated area, just because the technologies were creating new usage. So in democracy, I think regulation is critical, and I abide every single word that Massimo raised on the need of regulation. On the other hand, I also appreciate that technology provides new opportunity to learn how socially acceptable some new behaviors are, how as a human conscious we can create a collective perspective of a collective good. And certainly I feel that a regulation, if too soon, might be dictatorship, if too late, might be dictatorship too. So it's really back to your point, a momentum question. But I have two companies besides my work at Microsoft. One is also called Orbit. We're doing commercial spaceflight training, and we're preparing for the next generation of humans willing to go to space without being government employees, as more and more of these vehicles that we refer to, for Starship from SpaceX and others. And FAA, the American authority for training, has suspended every single way of restriction to let the industry set some own standard. It's kind of a given there will be accidents, and there was one nearly by Blue Origin unmanned, but a few weeks ago, and certainly there will be others. And then probably there will be a regulation coming into play. But truth, technology, and private sector is driving innovation that I think we shouldn't really disconsidered. And certainly that's really the type of forum like this where you think with decision makers, where you inform the general public that you create consciousness that can let regulation happen. If the internet had been regulated from the very beginning, it wouldn't exist.
I think it's a bit of a sad fact of life that regulations do tend to come after you've had at least some of the minor disasters, right? So hopefully some of the minor ones rather than some of the major ones. But it's kind of, I guess, also something that we're not really good at is like trying to both think through the worst case scenario and actually convince enough people that the worst case scenario is worth legislating about, because that requires a lot of agreement. Basically, as the Admiral was saying, it requires people to just agree to put limits on what they can do, and that can be a lot of a hard sell, especially if they haven't been doing that for the past, decade or so. So I don't think it's too late per se. I just think, as everybody else was saying, that it's probably tends to come in late, naturally.
Please.
Just to continue on this, for cyberspace, you had a lot of intents to try to bring norms into cyberspace. The problem is that you have very big divisions between countries on these norms. For example, in 2004, you had the Budapest Convention on Cyber Criminality, which has been signed by a lot of European countries, the US, but for example, in a lot of Asian countries, it's not recognized. So the problem is that some countries see the internet as a window of opportunity, and that they have used internet in a way, in different ways, for ransomware or also like some intelligence activities. So they didn't have so much interest into basically putting a framework. Now the threat is gaining ground, and discussions are getting more and more important, especially on the drawing red lines. So I think that what we tend to have now, it would be to say that attacks which are targeting critical infrastructure could be declared as an act of war. It is what many countries are declaring as a very big problem, but all the other cyber attacks which are not as important are usually not being, as we said, identified or attributed. This is a whole question, like in our lab we work with people from law, working in international law in this question. It's a huge debate about attribution, because once you attribute a cyber attack, you can consider it as an act of war. So it means that you could maybe react in a way that it's not in cyberspace, in concrete space. And even you have a lot of debates around what if a cyber attack results in casualties, like physical casualties. When you are attacking an hospital, for example, and if someone unfortunately die after this cyber attack, this is a casualty, then the status changes completely. So this kind of things are becoming more and more serious, and you see that each government, in France is the case, is getting more resources and more people to try to tackle this. The problem is that you can't stop any cyber attack. The only thing you can do is to make understand the attacker that the cost of attacking you is too great. Because if someone really wants to find a vulnerability, he will find it. But the problem is that if he has to spend so much money and has to build huge teams to just attack you, he maybe won't do it. So you need to prepare yourself as much as you can. After, regulation will help, certainly. But now we are just in a race of trying to secure what we can secure. But even in France, for example, we are very well organized. We have the ANSSI, Agence Nationale de Sécurité Services d'Information. But in other countries, they still do not have this kind of framework, and they are very, very vulnerable. And they do not have any international framework which are protecting them in case of an aggression from a bigger neighbor, for example. So let's hope we will find a way. But now cyber attacks is just part of some states' strategies. Well, you also have individuals. But for example, we've talked about North Korea before. You said that North Korea, surprisingly, is much higher in these rankings than Germany. Not South Korea, sorry, North Korea. It is very interesting because North Koreans, they are very good at cyber attacks, and they manage to get a lot of money and ransomware all over the world. For example, Bangladesh almost had to pay millions and billions of dollars to hackers in North Korea. So it was a state strategy, you know. So yes, we need to regulate it, but because it's political, and as I said before, you had conflicts in international institutions now, nothing is moving so far. So
NATO needs an Article 5.0 now, it sounds like.
yes.
Admiral, you were going to say?
Yes, to have a follow-on of the question on how to prevent a conflict. We have a very narrow path between Charybdis and Scylla. Charybdis being the absence of rules, not even talking about regulation, rules, just mere rules, common sense rules, and Scylla being too many regulations. And we have some lessons learned, I hope they are learned, or they have to be learned at least, in the third common, space, outer space, cyberspace, and the third common is the ocean. Seabed exploitation, minerals exploration, etc., etc. There are so many regulations which have been put in place when at the same time nothing is being done in diving and exploring, that everybody is stuck now. Nobody does want to invest because nobody knows whom your next discovery will belong to. Too many regulations under the UN umbrella. And this is Scylla. So I know it is a very narrow path, but once again, well, I'm a very optimistic person. I'm sure that mankind will find the right way by the end of the day.
Any other questions from, yes, I see your lady, yes, from our trustee, I think from Japan, actually. We have, do you want to shout it out and I can? And back into, yeah. The question about rubbish, trash, whatever you like to call it in space. I met in the through Asian Society Japan, actually, there's a Japanese venture I know that's been pioneering that commercial, you know, clearing up
That's
rubbish.
what I said before. I mean, space debris, it's a reality today, and regulation is simply late in the sense that it is an emergency. So how we are reacting? In the last few years, we start to have a number of studies and also first mission for active debris removal. But of course, when you start to, let's say, to learn how to do that, it's not simple for the reason that you said, that the space is already crowded, and there was a couple of famous events, unfortunately man-driven, by the Russians and the Chinese that made thousands and thousands and thousands of extremely dangerous debris. On the other hand, IOS, OOS, in orbit or on orbit servicing, and European Space Agency is moving ahead. the Commission is moving ahead, as well as the member state. France, in France 2030, we have technology development in the iOS. Italy, in the frame of Next Generation EU, has a huge program that I'm personally working, more than 230 million euros for iOS, so for build up capabilities to do action, which is including deorbiting, which is including active debris removal. It's yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue, and we are back to what we said before. Regulation should act a bit more in advance. And again, when we talk about mega constellations, every single satellite that we lose the control, if it's not in auto-cleaning orbit, it's a debris.
Admiral was saying that Kepler is helping on this problem. Perhaps Veolia, who and other French operators are very known around the world for garbage, they can go up to space.
Well, you have some startups in Europe who are working on that.
One in Japan, I think, and at least I'm aware of, yeah.
Yes, it's SST, space surveillance and tracking, and yeah, there are a lot of startups. But then I still remember, well, I'm an old space guy, so I like a lot the PowerPoint project. But at the end, going to space means that you need to have the legacy and the experience to make things functioning at the end, not just
some of them are rubbish.
Not just in a PowerPoint. I mean,
the gentleman with the glasses.
Just I want to say that Microsoft makes PowerPoint, so I feel obliged to respond.
Oh yeah, you've slighted PowerPoint now.
But it's also does AI calculation to actually, out of the mapping that exists, predict where you have debris and where their trajectory.
I'm a master in PowerPoint for my job.
We need a screen here, clearly. I mean, this is what Nowmay was telling us earlier. The gentleman with the glasses on. Oh, yeah, you're up now. Sorry. Yeah. So you launch it, you clean it up, and there's also been the issue of, I think, satellites returning to Earth, endangering human populations as well, because they haven't been pushed in the right direction. I think I'm talking about China here, but do you think this? I mean, something like that is just you launch it, you're responsible. Is that enforceable?
No,
and how?
The idea is great. My only question is, how do we enforce it? You remember when the Chinese launcher fell back a few months ago, and everybody was wondering where it would fall. And some people asked, well, if it does fall on a populated area, will the Chinese government pay for it? We're still waiting for the answer.
Anyhow, we already have in place regulation in the space industry, for instance, to avoid fragmentation of satellites. So this is already in place. And by the way, France was one of the first countries to move in this direction. So,
Laurent, I think you had a follow-up question. how can we follow on? Yeah, thank you. We heard about oceans already, and I think that's an excellent contribution. How can we help you in what you do?
But the confrontation is currently driven by China and America mainly. So I would expect that the roots of Asian society and the European chapter probably in between brings a lot of opportunity to start a space dialogue.
Sorry, yeah. We'll try to. Any other comments? I think I saw, yes, a hand here. Mr. Liu He, if I pronounced it correctly. Wait, your name sounds like a very other famous Chinese leader. So. Scylla Charybdis of Horizon Management. How do we get it right? Anybody want to pick that up? Does it just happen? I mean, financing is part of it. What else is?
I think in terms of technology per se, I already said, I mean, robotic and AI are really kind of building blocks of what we're going to do. But then, and I think we mentioned also in the panel, it's not just a technology journey. It's also, let's say, a multidisciplinary journey with, in my mind, is obliged path to put humanistic thinking in this frontier. So I think technology-based robotic and AI is fundamental, and I think is a first priority if we want to have outer space. Let's say, in line with the expectation of our knowledge as well as the return for the Earth. But it's also extremely important that we match to the technologies, also the humanistic view.
And on this, and I was super inspired by your question, actually. But one of the interesting underlying question to any technological or thinking project is human perspective. Have you ever heard of the overview effect? So it's a very powerful cognitive shock that every human that went to space, astronauts, or I've experienced. And if you ever Google William Shatner, the Star Trek actor, went to space with Blue Origin, with Jeff Bezos' rocket, and he wrote a book, which is out, I think, this week, where he speaks quite eloquently about it, seeing how fragile Earth is in the middle of the vastness of the space and how important it is to bind with one another. And I think that it's been well documented. I think many books about the overview effect that you can reflect on, where all the humans that went to space had a very different perspective of all the topics we discussed today. So maybe more humans in space will give us a chance to do better.
Our final panel we're going to next is Make the Youth Dream Again. Is that right? It's finished? Oh, that's finished. Now we're on to the next thing. So now we're going to join together, right? We're going to wrap up now. So 6:30, so we wrap up here. So we stay here, others come in. Those who were not interested in space, they don't know what they missed. We're going to have to tell them all about it. But I'd like to thank, we need a wrap up, and that's me. That's my cue, I think, right? So I would like to thank, actually, one last thing. Admiral, when we did a little video just now, you talked about the importance of education. I just wanted to pick up on that. We heard the sound of children outside. That's very relevant to what we're talking about here.
Well, education has to do with dialogue and knowledge sharing. And one of the things that Asia Society in Europe could do probably would be put together scientists, heads of labs, coming from the different countries we mentioned, China, the US, European labs, other Asian country labs, and mix them with specialists in social sciences, human sciences, philosophers, just to answer your question. Where do we go first? That would be probably useful.
I think, Aliette, you should definitely be in that room. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was actually going to say that one thing that's been striking me, because in my other job, I am also a parent of young children, is that there's it's not, education is not just about academics or about science or about knowledge, right? I think it should also be about developing empathy and developing collaborative problem solving, so that we learn to see both the other's position, our own position, and then how we can find some kind of middle ground or ground that is acceptable to all the parties. And I don't quite, at least what I'm seeing of the French system doesn't convince me that we're there yet in terms of imparting this.
On that note, thank you very much, Aliette, for your contribution, Admiral, Massimo, Nicolas, and Nowmay. We appreciate all of your time in the room and I think online. Thank you all. Thank you.